Loud. Great. I love how there's an option when it's recording, you can either say good or leave. Like, by golly, don't record me. But I'm so glad you all are here today, and I'm glad I got to be a part of a charge night with you all. I've really missed being with the charge group. Some of you I got to go on a trip with this summer, a very memorable trip that we took to Williamsburg. So it's really good to see you all. And it's also good to be with the rest of you who are a part of this great organization. Everybody loves charge. It's very exciting. And Wendy prepares the best. She gets the best speakers. She has the best stuff going on. So I know you all always appreciate that. Meghan Martin is here with us tonight. You can see Meghan. Well, she's in my top left-hand corner up there. But Meghan actually works with us now at KEDC, and we're very happy to have her with us. But you may have known Meghan from other things that you've been involved in, especially if it had to do with the MTSS or with school mental health or maybe PBIS. Meghan has done a lot of things, and she's worked with lots of agencies like KDE and others. She's worked with different universities such as University of Louisville, Eastern. She works with SROs. So Meghan has a wide variety of experiences and background that she brings to us. Tonight, she's going to be talking about effective teaching practices for challenging behavior. And when I saw that, I thought, boy, I sure could have used that when I was in the classroom, because there are times when you come upon someone, you're like, wow, that's a real challenge right there. So I'm excited to learn with you all. We always have the chat box going. If you have a question throughout, I'm sure Meghan wouldn't mind if you also wanted to ask a question, just to ask it. But if you want to put it in the chat box, I will monitor that, and we'll make sure that we ask all those questions. And Beth, don't let me forget to put the link at the end for our evaluation, okay? All right, good deal. So Meghan, I'll turn that over to you. It's not the best introduction, but I mean, you have so much in there to talk about. But anyway, we're really glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's good to be here. So I will first start by saying I have heard wonderful things about this charge group. Not only the trips that you took this past summer, but some of the work going on in your schools and in your classrooms. So I think as we start, it would help me just to know if you would drop in the chat what school you are working in currently and what your role is. That'll just kind of help me as we get started. If you don't care to drop it in the chat, unless you're driving. If you're driving, please don't drop it in the chat. Several Pineville, Pulaski, great. Several West Irvin, Estill Springs, Lynn Camp. Okay, great. I see a Barberville Independent. Well, it's great to be here with you all today. So really what we're going to talk about and do a little professional learning around is effective teaching practices with students with challenging behaviors. So I'm sure that at this point in the year, our students' honeymoon period is over, if there was one, by this time. And this is about the time right before fall break where we typically start getting lots of phone calls around behavior, having some inappropriate behaviors and students with challenging behaviors, and classroom teachers really struggling or administrators struggling with knowing how to handle those and what to do with those kiddos. So we're going to talk about what that looks like in the classroom and some practices that you can put in place within your classrooms to maybe avoid that and increase some of the active engagement with these students. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you all let me know if this is showing correctly.
It is.
Okay, great. So we will go ahead and jump in to some of our effective teaching practices and kind of what this looks like. And it really doesn't matter if you're in a kindergarten classroom, a third grade classroom, or a high school classroom. All of these are evidence-based and research-based practices that can go K-12 across any content. So that's one of the reasons that we oftentimes talk about these effective practices, which we can call sometimes high leverage practices, and we'll talk about that a little bit, or just effective teaching practices. So I'm going to switch my screens here. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult. Is that slide deck progressing for you all?
Yes, it says activity now.
All right. So I want you to think about this and whatever role you're in, wherever you are. All of your retirement and life savings are riding on the outcomes of a specific classroom over the next week. Now, what classroom is it? It's not your classroom. It is a new teacher. She might be across the hallway. She might be down the hallway or next door, but it's a new teacher that you are mentoring. And the question is, if she is successful this week, you will win this bet like you were gambling and double your retirement. But if this teacher is not successful, you will lose it all, being your retirement and your life savings. So I want you to think about that just a second. If you were to bet your retirement on what you had to do in order to help her be successful, what are some of the things that you would tell her? Or what are some of the things that you would work to teach her? What are some of the things that you would really want to make sure she has in place in her classroom to be successful? So drop that in the chat really quickly if you can.
If you all can't see the chat, you may have to hit your escape button.
So I see structures, procedures, organization, consistency, management, classroom management, picking your battles. I love that, Angela. We'll talk about that too. Procedures, procedures, procedures. Teach the content. Great.
I love engaging lessons.
Yes. Brandy has dropped in there, being calm. Absolutely. So oftentimes we know what it takes to have a successful classroom. We know what that looks like. We know how to put those things in place, but we have kids who sometimes challenge those practices that we know what they look like. And we have to think about how we are going to handle those in advance before they happen, before we're in the heat of the moment in the classroom. And really prepare for some of those things. So what we're going to talk about today probably is not a lot of earth-shattering information for you all. I know that you all have heard these things before, but we'll talk about kind of what that looks like in classrooms with kiddos if you had to bet on it. So when we think about classrooms that are successful, oftentimes we hear our students on task 80% of the time. And are students able to stay in the classroom to learn instructional content, learn whatever the content is for that particular classroom? So when we talk about successful classrooms today, we will kind of go back to this and think about, are 80% of your students on task 80% of the time? And what does that look like for you in your specific setting? So effective instruction, we know, has to include classroom management, but classroom management isn't always the only thing that we have to include. So we have to include high rates of success for students. And we know that oftentimes motivation is an issue for some of our kiddos, as well as that success rate. And so how many of you all have ever heard that 4-to-1 success rate? We have to use 4 positives to every negative we use with kiddos in order to help them build that intrinsic motivation and want to be successful. Let me know if you've heard that number before, 4-to-1. I think probably at some point, all of us have heard that number, that ratio of positive and negative interaction and feedback. So that ratio of 4-to-1 actually came from something outside of education. It came from marriage counseling research. So there was a study done in the late 80s where they determined that husbands and wives that were in counseling or in therapy that had a 4-to-1 positive to negative interaction ratio were about 80% more likely to be married 10 years later than those that didn't. So some of you may want to go home and share that with your husband or with your wife tonight, but that is actually where that number came from. So when we look at the education research and what that looks like for that positive to negative ratio, it really looks more like 10 to 1 or 12 to 1. So I want you to think about some of your most challenging kiddos that you deal with on a daily basis or that you've had in the past. Think about how difficult that 10 to 1 ratio might sound or might seem. Drop your thought in the chat about what are your thoughts when you think about that 10 to 1 ratio and being able to do that with students who are struggling with classroom behavior or classroom expectations. Do you think that's an easy ratio to get to? Do you think it would be challenging? What does that look like? I see difficult, challenging, hard. We often focus on the negative behavior, difficult. I absolutely agree. Those ratios, when we think about it, those are difficult. We're thinking about 12 positive interactions or things that we can communicate to students as far as feedback and other things of that nature. But we as the classroom teacher are always in control of that learning environment in our classrooms. And we have to think about how we can set ourselves up for success. So when we're thinking about providing feedback and those positive interactions, we have to really provide additional opportunities to respond and engagement for kiddos so that we are able to provide more of those positive interactions. So I want you to be thinking about that as we go into some of the strategies we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about high leverage practices. High leverage practices are a set of practices that are fundamental to student support and student learning in classrooms. They really are taught explicitly. And when I say explicitly, I mean, we are using that direct explicit instruction that I do, we do, you do in order to teach these things. And we know that classrooms that are implementing high leverage practices have much better success ratios. So what does that look like for a success ratio? It means our academic achievement increases, and it means that our behavior decreases. So I'm going to just share an overview really quickly with the high leverage practices. And then you guys, if you want to, there are resources within the slide deck that you can go back later. There are some videos that you can click on and watch, and some additional resources around this. But when we think about these high leverage practices, they really are in 4 different domains. So those domains are collaboration, assessment, social emotional behavior, as well as instruction. So we're going to touch on a few of those that are in all of the different domains today. But as you can see on the right, within each of those, if you look at instruction, just look at high leverage practice 16 within instruction. It says using explicit instruction. So we're going to talk a little bit about explicit instruction with behavior and how that looks a little bit different than what it looks like with reading or math oftentimes. There's another resource that is linked within your slide deck, and it really looks at the high leverage practices for general education, high leverage practices for special education, and how that relates back to our professional standards as teachers and where we can really embed those. So today we're going to look at 5 or actually 6 of these. So we're going to look at establishing consistent, organized, and respectful learning environments, providing that positive and constructive feedback, teaching the social behaviors using explicit instruction, flexible grouping, and active engagement. So those are the ones that we're really going to focus on today. So I want you to think about what instruction oftentimes looks like for behavior. There are 3 words that we oftentimes hear in schools when we are talking about behavior and we are talking about student misbehavior or inappropriate behavior. Drop in the chat if you know what those 3 words are that we oftentimes default to. As teachers, sometimes as parents, as administrators, and even as counselors, sometimes we often default to these 3 words when it comes to inappropriate behavior. What are those 3 words? Drop it in the chat. Let's see who knows what they are. Okay, I see a don't, I see a stop, and there's one more. And the no. So those are our 3 words when we think about behavior that we oftentimes default to. No, stop, and don't. So oftentimes when we're doing trainings and we think about behavior and how we're going to utilize positive language to talk to kids in order to interact with kids, and oftentimes correct kids when that misbehavior presents, we will put those 3 words on Post-it notes and wad them up and throw them away. So if you can think about that, I want you to think about throwing those 3 words out the window right now, wherever you are. So when we think about instruction, we'll tie it a little bit into our multi-tiered prevention system. And we know that universally all students must receive the same supports. And so really when we think about supports with academics, we would never expect a student to, if a first grader said 2 + 2 is 5, we would never expect that student to learn anything different unless we retaught that content. But with behavior, we oftentimes expect them to know or understand something that we're not teaching them. So with behavior, we really have to think about, just like you all said earlier, those expectations, those routines and arrangements within our classrooms and within our buildings. So when we think about expectations, those are the things that we want students to do. What are the things we want them to do? And the routines and arrangements are 100% up to the adults in our buildings. So when we think about those routines and arrangements, I'm sure some of you have been in buildings, maybe where you have a supervision schedule, you may have a hallway duty schedule or a bus duty schedule. But what happens when 1 teacher or 2 teachers or 5 teachers don't show up to those scheduled duties or to supervision times? We know that that's when oftentimes behavior presents. We know that kids are always watching to see where adults are. And so we really have to be thinking about, how are we as the adults in charge of the learning environment in our classrooms and in our buildings, monitoring and ensuring that we are following our routines and arrangements like they were designed to be implemented. So that's one thing that we have to think about school-wide. We also want to think about how we are teaching these expectations. And when we say teaching expectations, we mean very explicitly teaching our kiddos. What is it? You know, you see the poster on the screen, it says, be nice. Well, what does nice mean? What does that look like? What does that sound like? Is that going to look differently to a kindergarten student as opposed to a junior in high school? Obviously it is. So when we think about those anchors that we're tying back to everything within our school-wide expectations, we really want to make sure that those things are clearly defined. So if we have respectful as one of our anchors, school-wide anchor, do all of our teachers know and understand what our definition at such and such school is of respect? Do we know what that looks like in all of the different areas? And so oftentimes with our increase in teacher turnover, we have lots of new teachers. We have teachers that are coming out of alt-cert programs. We have administrators who are new across the state in, I believe, every district. We really have to think about, are all of us on the same page about what these expectations are? Do we have those defined? And are we teaching students explicitly? So not just assuming that students know and understand, but actually teaching them, modeling those things, showing them what that looks like. So we have to think about our school-wide expectations first, and then we move into our classroom expectations. So when we think about those classroom expectations, are those clearly stated? Are we teaching those, again, explicitly? So when we think about those classroom rules or classroom expectations, we oftentimes do teach those pretty explicitly. But the thing that we find that is missing sometimes is that we are not teaching our students what that standard consequence is. So do we have a standard consequence? Do we have something that is in writing that we can deliver to parents and to students and new teachers? If I walk in the building as a brand new teacher, is there something I can look at that tells me these are the steps I take as a classroom teacher? Step 1, step 2, step 3. At what point are the behaviors disruptive enough or disrespectful enough for an administrator to talk to kiddos? So we have to be thinking about those expectations within the classroom and ensuring that our teachers are teaching those explicitly. The other thing we have to think about is that they're not just teaching those the first 10 days of school or the first 12 days of school. They're really teaching these things on an ongoing basis. After long breaks, some of our kids need these things on a daily basis as reminders, as you all know. So the teaching of expectations is key. And then we think about scheduling. Somebody earlier said, I would make sure that that brand new teacher, if I'm rolling the dice on her and I'm betting on my retirement, I'm going to make sure that she's consistent in her classroom, that she's following that schedule, that schedule is even in place. So making sure that schedules are in place and that times for different activities and different groupings in our classrooms are appropriate. So thinking about how long can a first grade student be in an independent group? How long can a 16-year-old be in an independent group? Sometimes those times are the same, we know, but we have to think about those things and think about the students and the content that we're teaching. We also want to think about the physical arrangement of our classrooms. We oftentimes talk about the 3-second rule. So I want every student in my classroom to think that I can get to them within 3 seconds. Now, can I really get to them within 3 seconds? Maybe not, but I want them to think that I can. So when you think about how classrooms are set up, or how your learning environments are set up wherever you are, think about your lines of sight and think about that 3-second rule. So can I get to my students? Now, the other thing I want you to think about is, do we have students who are identified immediately as a behavior concern or a student who is presenting challenging behavior? And the answer is pretty much always yes. We know within a few days who in our classrooms is going to be a challenge. So I want you to think about the stars, look at the desks and the way this classroom is set up, and look at the stars. So when you think about those stars, those are our students who are presenting challenging behavior. What is something that you notice about where the teacher is, which is the T, the blue T, and those students? What's something you notice? We're using proximity for sure. What's something else that you notice? They are in a triangle and they are right up front, right? So are our kids always going to be up front? Absolutely not. But if this teacher's content is that she is this particular day delivering new content and instruction, and she's using her smartboard in the front of the room, then maybe this is where she wants to see these 3 kiddos during this day. She also wants to be thinking about that 3-second rule and how quickly can I get to those kids? We want to make sure that our learning environments are set up so that we don't, as the teacher, get caught, so to speak, in any specific area of the classroom, that we're able to move around on all sides of our students very quickly and get to them in a very short amount of time in order for our teaching to be effective. Now, I want you to look at this for just a second. What is wrong with this setup in my classroom? What's wrong with this? Just drop it in the chat. What's wrong with the setup in this classroom? Kids are really far from each other. There's a group in the back that's hard to get to. The teacher can't move around freely. So think about that line of movement. If we go to the next slide, about where those kids are. I've missed one, I'm sorry. So think about where those kids are and where that teacher is. If I have to go to the student that's in the front row on the far right, and then I need to go to the student that's in the back row on the far left, there's no easy pathway. There is no easy way to get from point A to point B. So we have to think about how could we rearrange this? What might that look like in order to make sure we can use proximity and use it effectively? Here's another example. What are your thoughts on this one? Is this a good classroom setup? Is this a challenging classroom setup for those kids that have stars that are presenting inappropriate behavior in classrooms? What do you think about this one? Good, bad, or ugly? Drop it in the chat. If you think it's good, tell me why. Several of you say this one is a good one, easy access. When you think about that 3-second rule, we can get to all of those kiddos pretty quickly and we can move around on all sides of the arrangement. What about this one right here? What are your thoughts on this one? Good, bad, or ugly? Great point. Sarah said in some of the classrooms, it seems like some of the kids have been moved to an area that may motivate them. Could be a windowsill, could be a floor. Absolutely. So do you have not only flexible grouping, but do you have flexible seating? Okay, we have this one isn't great. Too many stars together looking in the back. Absolutely. So we want to separate kids if possible, but how do we do that when we're using flexible grouping and some of those kids fall within the same groups? How would you handle that? Maybe again, use proximity. So if I'm doing a guided station somewhere and I know that I have a flexible group that has more behaviors, I want to make sure that that group's as close to me as possible if I'm not working with them one-on-one. So lots of things to think about. What about the setup in this room? What are your thoughts here? What do you think about the circle grouping? Spread out, easy access. Notice where the stars are. They are very close to that teacher's line of sight. She's able to see them very quickly and can move around. So this is one that we think would be a good setup in classrooms. So one of the things that we're going to be thinking about is how are we structuring our learning environments? Absolutely. When we think about proximity, we know that we need to be able to move around the room freely. And again, be thinking about that 3-second rule. Reactive proximity, when students are presenting inappropriate behavior, you're always going to start, of course, with that eye contact. And we know that as teachers, we all are really good at the look, so to speak. Kids know when we give them the look, what we mean and what we're talking about, that we want them to stop whatever the inappropriate behavior is they are presenting. But then the next step is going to be taking one step toward them. It doesn't have to be immediately going to their desk, but maybe moving just a little bit closer. And once we are continuing to move closer, is the behavior stopping or is it continuing? If it is continuing, we can just interrupt that behavior with a question. The question needs to be one-on-one with the student. No one else should be able to hear it. And the question can be something very simple like, can you show me what you should be doing? Or what are we working on as a class? So think about how you handle when proximity doesn't work. Are we using some prompting? Are we using some cueing when that proximity doesn't work? So the next strategy we're going to talk about is using choice. How do we use choice? Are we using it effectively in order for students to get what they need out of it and us as teachers also get what we need? There is a way to do that. So when we think about choice, oftentimes students come in, we give them some type of task that they should be working on, whether it's reading, answering questions, working on some hands-on activities. And we don't always give them choices. So what happens when the student comes in and says, I'm not doing that today. I don't feel like it. Or they take that piece of paper and they throw it on the floor and say, this is stupid. I'm not doing this. What happens then, right? So number one, you need to be thinking about, do we know who these kiddos are? And can we be proactive? So when they walk in the door, before they ever sit down and we talk about the task, can we say to that student, listen, we're going to be working on some things today, and I want you to be able to have the choice. Would you like to do A or would you like to do B? The key with choices and using them effectively with students in classrooms is that we as the teacher have to be okay with either choice that they choose. So the choices are not, do you want to do your math or do you want to go outside and play on the playground? Because we're not okay with the second choice of, do you want to go outside and play? We want them to get content. The choices have to be something such as, do you want to work on this independently or would you prefer to work in a group? Sometimes we can give choice to the whole class, and sometimes we're just giving choice to one individual student. So look at the bottom box where the choice has been given to Johnny. So it says, Johnny, I want you to make a choice. So the student feels a little bit of control. The student feels a little bit of power. You can either get your math project done or you can get started on your writing assignment. It's totally up to you which one. So when kids feel like they have a choice, oftentimes they're much more likely to dig in and start on the task that is at hand. So let's listen to this. See if we can get this to play. You all have to let me know that you can hear the sound. I tested it earlier, but just let me know with a thumbs up or thumbs down if you don't care. So watch this example of giving choice in a classroom.
Hey guys, let's start group work. Hey, how's everybody doing? You ready to go? Nina, why don't you come over and join the group?
No, I'm sick of it.
Nina, if you'll just join the group, I know we can get this done in no time.
I'm not going
What's the problem, Nina? I just need you to join the group.
because I hate it.
Look, here's what I'm going to do. Today, we're working on either the group work or the PBL project. And I understand that you're very mature, you're older, and you always work with me. So I'm going to give you two choices, the group work or the project. And I trust you to make a great choice. What do you think you'd like to do?
I want to work on the computer.
The choices are the group work or the, Isaac, you can go ahead and sharpen your pencil. Your choices are the group work or the PBL project. Look, I know you can make a great choice here because I trust you to make great choices. So what would you like to do?
I guess I'll do the group work.
That's a great choice. Fantastic idea. Nina, why don't you go ahead and join the group?
Now, we all know that it's not always that easy, right? We all know that sometimes that kiddo that says no 3 and 4 and 5 times until they flip the desk over. So we know what that looks like. But I want you to think about how this teacher that you saw in this video used choice, and what were some of the things that he said or that he did that you could utilize with challenging students. So the question is, what did the teacher do or say that you could use with challenging students? Giving choice. Brittany, he was encouraging and kept a calm voice. Absolutely. Our adults being regulated in classrooms is key with kids with challenging behaviors. They are always going to be a little bit louder than any adult wants to be. Remained calm, did not appear angry. I love that. He used the phrase, I know you are older and more mature. Absolutely. So he's working on some of those social and emotional skills at the same time, a little bit of self-esteem in there. He said that he trusted the students. Absolutely. He put the power in the student's hands, and he stuck, Kara, I love that you've mentioned this. He stuck to the same two choices. So when she said, no, I don't want to do it, I want to work on the computer, he didn't give in, so to speak, and say, well, okay, if you do this, then I'm going to give you some computer time. When we do things like that, the student really has the negotiating power over the adult. So we want to make sure that when we give those 2 or 3 choices that we are giving to students, that number one, we're okay with both choices, and number 2, that we stick to those choices. The student did not feel like they were being patronized. Absolutely. They also didn't feel like, he did not make the student feel like she was in trouble, treated her with respect. Absolutely. So I want you to think about choice and how you've used that previously in classrooms or with specific kids that you work with. Does anybody have an example of how you have used choice in order to be successful with challenging students in classrooms? Any examples? We have lots of students who actually, as a part of some type of check-in and check-out system with teachers, they may receive a choice immediately when they walk into classrooms. Or it may be that teachers are working together as a team or a group, and they have choices that they know the student will respond to, that they're sharing those with one another. In order for that to happen, the communication has to be very clear and very open among teachers that are working with the same students. Any questions with choices? Any questions? All right, the next strategy that we are going to look at is called behavior momentum. How many of you have ever heard of behavior momentum or have ever used it? Anybody ever used behavior momentum? So let's look at what it is, and that might help us think about it. So it really is a strategy. You're increasing the probability of appropriate on-task behavior when we ask a student to do things that are not hard for them to do, things that they typically like to do or things that they want to do. So I want you to think about this. As a teacher, the student comes in, they sit down and they say, Johnny, you should get your project finished this morning. That's what I expect. And the student immediately is like, no. That student is being a little defiant. They do not want to work on the project. Maybe it's first period, maybe it's second period, and they've had a rough start to the day. And then first period was even a little bit rougher. So that kiddo is saying immediately no. So when we're using behavior momentum, we are talking to these same kids and we're thinking about things that, number one, are very easy, or number two, we know they enjoy doing or like doing. So if you look at the box on the bottom, if we're using behavior momentum, we may say something like, Johnny, can you come help me with these books? I've got to move them from this table over to the bookshelf. Maybe this kiddo loves helping. Maybe this kiddo has some type of sensory issues and he needs some heavy work activities to move something heavy in order to regulate. So the student is able to get up, help, move around the room. He moves the books for the teacher. The teacher is able to then set herself up to say, thank you, I really appreciate your help. The next thing the teacher is going to say is, hey, Johnny, do you care to sharpen these 3 pencils? Johnny loves the pencil sharpener, and we know that. And so he immediately grabs the pencils and says, yes, I'd love to, Miss Martin. And he goes over and he sharpens the pencil. And then the third thing we're asking Johnny to do is, now, would you like to get your project out and get started in order to finish it this morning? So when we build students up with that behavior momentum, it's setting them up for being successful at very small tasks, things that they like to do or they want to do, or they can be successful doing, and then working very easily into the tasks that we really need them to do. So what might behavior momentum look like in the classroom?
Hey, Tanaya, I need a student that's really responsible to do something for me. Do you think that could be you?
Yes.
All right, good. I was hoping so because I've been talking to your coach about how responsible you've been in basketball and how you've really been stepping up in practice. And so I need someone who can have that responsibility in my class to help me. You think you can? All right, can you move those paws, the blue paws from the whiteboard back over to the chalkboard for me? Thank you. All right, guys, let's make sure we're working on our bell work, okay? We need to be working. Hey, tonight, thanks for doing that for me. I know it takes a lot of responsibility sometimes to do things that I ask, and I really appreciate it. And I see that you are becoming more responsible, and I'm really, really proud of you. And, you know, that's our classroom reward system. So I only trust students who are really responsible to move those paws because I could mess up another class's score. Since you're being so responsible, do you think you could do me something else? All right. Can you get my iPad off of my computer for me so I can take attendance? Thank you. Thank you so much, Shania. Hey, thank you for being so responsible and getting that. You know, I don't let everyone go back there.
Well, my video stopped playing. All right, so I want you to think about what you just saw with behavior momentum in that classroom. Now, I'm not sure about anybody else, but I hope that you were able to ignore those bookshelves because all I can think is that they're going to fall over on those kids and there are books stacked all over them. So I want you just to think and focus on how this teacher talked to the student and what that looks like. How could you tell that the student in the video maybe had some challenging behavior? What were some of the things that you noticed? What did you notice about the teacher or the student and how she was able to ask the student to do a few things? She wasn't working on the bell ringer. What else did you notice that she was doing? She did not have her workout. Her head was down. She also would not make eye contact with the teacher. Even when the teacher was standing at her desk talking to her, she was looking away, and she was also chewing on something. So we don't know if that was gum. We don't know if that was the top of a pen. We're not sure what that is. She had some dropped shoulders and was very disengaged. So she absolutely was not wanting to engage with that teacher. And the teacher was asking her to do some of those small things that she knew she enjoyed doing, being a helper. So when we think about that, that is what behavior momentum looks like. We're asking students to do small, simple tasks in order to get them in the mindset of being compliant and working on a task we are assigning them. The task is always going to be something that is content related, but what is it that we need them to do in our classroom that day to be successful? So behavior momentum, I want you to think about if you have a kid right now that you think you might be able to use behavior momentum with. Do you have a student you think you might be able to use behavior momentum with?
Megan, I have a question.
Absolutely.
I definitely get this, and I like to use that with kids. I also try to be careful that I've got this great kid over here that also loves to get my iPad or whatever. I want to give that kid a chance who really is doing all the good stuff to do special things too.
Absolutely. So when we think about classroom universal instruction and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, we have 4 levels of acknowledgement for kids. And so when we think about things like behavior momentum, we're using behavior momentum with kids that are not responding to those first 2 or 3 levels of acknowledgement. So when you think about level 1, that is verbal and non-verbal acknowledgement. So it might be a thumbs up, it might be a thank you, I appreciate you. And we have some kids who respond to that and some kids who don't. When we think about the next 2 levels of acknowledgement, it really goes into maybe publicly acknowledging kids and using things that we have in classrooms that are contingent. So think about how she had the kiddos move the little girl move the paws from one side of the board to the other. She probably has a student do that every single day. That's probably part of her daily routine. So she may use it with, just like Jackie was sharing, those kids that like and feed off that acknowledgement. She may use it with those kids who are always doing what they're supposed to be doing on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then on Tuesday, she may use that for 1 or 2 students for behavior momentum. So you're kind of mixing it up all the time, and you're not using that same strategy with the same kid every day, because we know that that's probably not going to be effective after about day 3 if we're doing that. So I would say a lot of you have probably used things like behavior momentum, but you may not have realized you were using it. So behavior momentum is one of our evidence-based practices for challenging students, called behavior momentum. So let's think about disruptive students. This is something that we oftentimes get questions about. Schools are struggling with kids that are disruptive while instruction is occurring. So when we think about disruptive behaviors, I'm going to go back to, as a school or as a district, have we really defined what disruption is? Do all of our teachers know? If we have that first year teacher across the hall from us, and I have had an EBD unit for 18 years, my tolerance level is going to be very different than that year 1 teacher. So are we defining the disruptive behavior? Are we giving examples? Are we talking about what that looks like or sounds like with kids? So that's something we have to think about, is are we being consistent across the school and across classrooms? But once we have that consistency, we still are going to have kids that present with disruptive behaviors. So when we think about disruptive behaviors, it's typically when I cannot continue delivering content with the behavior that's going on. So we may have used planned ignoring, we may have used some of those others like proximity, we may have used prompting and cueing or behavior momentum, and the student's behavior is still such that I cannot continue delivering content. It's disruptive to the other kids' learning. So that's what when we talk about disruptive behaviors, that's really what we're looking at, is I cannot continue to deliver content. So disruptive behaviors and thinking about the purpose. Why are kids being disruptive? Drop in the chat. Why do we think kids are being disruptive? I see bored and attention seeking. Any other reasons? They may not be able to actually do the task that's connected to the content. Absolutely. They may not be emotionally regulated at the moment. They may be under or overstimulated. Absolutely. When we think about disruption, kids that are disrupting are not engaged. So why are they not engaged in our content? We have to think about the function of that behavior. But even if we don't know what the function of the behavior is, we still can address it appropriately. So are we modeling with students? Are we providing those reminders? And are we avoiding those predictable triggers? So if we have students, we oftentimes know what their triggers are. Now, when I say avoiding triggers, I don't mean that we tiptoe around kids and we don't ask them to complete tasks in classrooms. I just mean if it's a trigger for a student to sit in the front of the room, where is their assigned seat? If it is a trigger for a student to talk about a specific content, then do they have an alternative assignment during that time? So when we think about those predictable triggers, have we been able to identify those, and do we know how to handle them? If you are not able to identify those triggers, that's something that you can always reach out to an administrator, a school counselor, your school social worker, a therapist that the kid may be working with, in order to help you identify those triggers in order to avoid them. So when we think about disruption, we oftentimes don't think about the part that the adult in the classroom plays in the disruptive behavior. So I want you to watch this video, and I want you to think about the teacher and how she handles this student appropriately or inappropriately, and what you would have done differently.
Caleb, cool it. Okay, everyone, I need you to get your papers out from yesterday. Those need to be on your desk. Caleb, if you do not have yours out, that will be a 0 for this assignment. Caleb, I am not going to play these games with you today. Pick up the paper or go to the office. Pick it up. Caleb, I don't know what your problem is, but you will not be disruptive in my class. Do you understand what I'm saying?
What y'all looking at?
That's it. To the office. Now.
So it was pretty apparent right off the bat that this teacher was not handling some of the disruptive behavior appropriately. What are some of the things that the teacher or the adult did to trigger this student? What did the adult do to trigger the student? She calls him out one time, absolutely, and embarrasses him in front of the classroom. She is very loud about it, right? She assumes he doesn't have the paper. She was engaging with him. So she was, when he would say something or he would move his desk around, she then was continuing to engage with him. So she was giving him a trigger, and every time that happened, he was giving her one back. And she was able to engage with him again and again. So it became a power struggle, didn't it? It became a power struggle within that. So what are some of the things that you would have done differently? How would you have handled this student in your classroom? Drop that in the chat. What are some of the things you could have used with this student with this disruptive behavior? Do a private or quiet check-in with him. Absolutely. You could have gotten the other students started and then talked to him privately somewhere. Given acknowledgement to other students who were doing the right thing. Use proximity. You could have ignored him, checked on him to see if he needed a new paper, redirected. Absolutely. So we have to think about our students and triggers. So we want to avoid the triggers, and unfortunately, sometimes we as the adult can be the trigger. So we have to think about not only what we're saying to kids, but how we're saying those things. What does that sound like? What is the intonation of our voice, the tone, the speed? We have to think about all of those things when we're thinking about disruptive behaviors, and think about, are we emotionally regulated? As an adult and a teacher, we will never ever de-escalate a kid or help them co-regulate if we ourselves are not emotionally regulated. So we have to think about those things as well. So when it comes to disruptive behaviors, can you recognize very quickly an agitated student? Are we looking at their body language? Are we looking at how they are interacting with other students? Do they look like they typically look when they walk in our classroom? Are their eyes darting back and forth? Do they seem like they're breathing very fast or heavy? So we have to be really conscious about some of those nonverbal cues that we should be using as teachers. And when we see those things, are we handling that in a private manner, talking to the student, asking how we can help the student instead of telling the student that their behavior is inappropriate? So we have to think about all those things. I am looking at my time, and Jackie, you jump in here, but it's 4:52, and I know that you need several minutes to complete evaluation today. I will share with you all. This slide deck is available to you. It has lots of links in it. There are some additional behaviors that there are some embedded videos that you may want to watch at a later time about really provoking students and how adults do that. There are also some videos on non-compliance and students who seem to be very defiant with teachers in classrooms, as well as disrespect. So we have some key reminders in here. There are a couple slides that you can pull out and use any way that you all want that would be helpful to you. And there are also several embedded videos that may be helpful. The last one I believe that we have in here is aggressive behavior as well, because we are seeing an uptick in aggressive behaviors that students are presenting across the state, unfortunately. And we know how that can impact classrooms as well. So Jackie, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you close however you need to.
Okay. Well, thank you, Megan, so much. I did put the evaluation link in the chat box, but does anybody have any questions? We have a few minutes left for Megan. Anything maybe really specifically, or, you know, like, hey, I've got this kid, I've never seen this, whatever it is before. She may have a good idea, or any other kind of question. And feel free to unmute.
I have a really good group of kids this year. They're really a high group of kids, but they're very talky. And I've found in my 18 years of teaching that typically the higher groups are more chatty with each other. And so that's something that I've really been trying to work on this year, is just kind of keeping that down to a minimum. Any ideas for things that other people have done? Just to keep down, it's not any kind of disruptive behaviors or, you know, outbursts, anything like that. It's just, there's a lot of chatter, and, you know, it's like they think if you're not looking dead at them, you can't hear them. Or if you have to stop and like make something work on the computer, or, you know what, they think that's an invitation to talk. And so it's just a constant battle for me, trying to kind of keep that at bay. Any ideas for that?
So I will first say that oftentimes our gifted students and our high performing students absolutely are very chatty or talkative. And it's oftentimes because they are very engaged, almost hyper focused sometimes on things that are going on. So I think that there's a difference in, are our kids talking all the time about the content in the classroom, or are they talking about things that are off topic? So, you know, I think you have to think about both of those things. But our kids that again are high flyers, we really want to make sure if they're talky or talkative, that they are wanting to communicate. So do we have alternative ways for them to communicate? Can they have an alternative way to communicate with a journal or an iPad or their Chromebook or things of that nature? So I think that we want to think about all of those things. And then again, are they engaged? So is our content challenging enough where they're having to spend some of that time thinking and cognitively processing in order to challenge them? Because we know that those students who are high performers, oftentimes everything comes super easy to them and they get their work completed. And then that allows additional time for some of those other off-task behaviors. So anybody else?
I did want to say that Lynn asked if I would post the check-in Google form. I don't have it, so I texted Wendy. Or does anybody have that link? I don't remember doing that before with sessions, so I don't have that one.
I don't think we've been doing check-ins anymore. I know we did that at one point, but I think now we just fill out the evaluation form.
That's the way we've done it in other sessions, so that was kind of new to me. So Lynn, hopefully that will take care of it. And I've not heard back from Wendy, but either way, don't sweat it. We'll make it work. Thank you, Kim. Anybody else have any questions? That was a good question.
It's not a question, but it's kind of an answer to that. I have one of those classes as well, my 6th period class. I have juniors, and my 4th period class is also juniors, but they will not speak a word. But 6th period, all they want to do is talk. And so I've had to adjust kind of how I handle class, and I have to give a lot of group work and opportunities for them to talk to one another, because otherwise they're going to find some way to talk. So I've tried to structure my classes and my assignments so that they're spending more time talking to each other about content. And that tends to, or has so far tended to help my issue of chattiness in that class.
Well, something else, I attended Monday. I don't even know what day it is. A family-friendly certification training where our school is going to be like a family-friendly certified school. And one of the things that really resonated with me from that training, one of the slides talked about the amount of information that's retained by students. And it talked about this different strategies. And I've seen this before, but it just hit me this week that 90% of what they teach someone else, they retain. And I know that's true for myself too, as a learner. And so that's one thing, because they like to talk and because of that statistic, that I was going to try to implement more of, and kind of not necessarily let them know who's going to be the teacher, but maybe they talk about it in their group, but then somebody has to be ready to present and they don't know who. And so use like my random name chooser or whatever. And then, you know, that person's the one that has to get up. So that was one of the things I was going to try. So thank you for that.
Tracy Mills has a question in the chat box. What would you do with a 1st grade student who's highly anxious and refuses to do work or engage in group work or activities due to anxiety? He's highly intelligent, but usually doesn't complete work due to issues with anxiety. He doesn't have any type of diagnosis.
So with a 1st grader, we know that lots of different things are impacting behavior at that point. I think with any kid that is presenting with anxiety in classrooms, especially younger kids, the first thing that I would encourage is to build that positive relationship, that positive adult-student relationship, and then work with the student or the counselor or the family to figure out what are some of the things that calm the student with the anxiety. So is he learning or she learning any type of coping skills or de-escalation strategies that we can use across settings? So are we using something at home that may work in the classroom? Is there something that we are teaching in the classroom, such as breathing or some type of setting? When I say setting, I mean like something that is calming the student in order to get that anxiety under control and be able to complete work. And I'm sure that if it's severe enough that they probably are working on getting the student in to see someone to maybe see if there is a possible diagnosis. But with anxiety, the number one thing is those relationships and that they trust us as the teacher in the classroom.
Anybody else? It's so good to be with you all this evening. Like I said, Megan does work with us at KDC. She works with on our grants team. We're very glad to have her. So email us, email her if you have questions, follow-up questions or whatever. We'd be glad to help you with that. And I guess we'll wrap up unless anyone has any last thing.
And Jackie, I'm not sure how they will get the slide deck, so I don't know if that's something that.
Wendy.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll just make sure Wendy I think anyway, just make sure Wendy has it and she'll make sure it goes where it needs to go. All right. You're getting lots of thank yous and I love this one. This was one that everyone could find something to use. That's right. That's right. No matter how many years you've been teaching, it's always good to go, oh, there's something I could do. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you have a great fall break. I'm sure that's coming up pretty soon. Some of you might not be getting fall break, but I think you probably are, most of you anyway. So we'll see you. If you need us, you let us know, okay? And Megan, do you care to hit stop recording?